Welcome to All About Agatha, the podcast dedicated to reading and ranking every single mystery novel written by the Queen of Crime, Dame Agatha Christie. I'm Catherine Brobeck.
And I'm Kemper Donovan.
And this week, we are doing something a little bit different. We are, exciting. We are doing 2 short stories. 2 for the price of 1, folks.
What a deal.
I know. We have a theme, Kemper.
We do indeed.
And that theme is one Countess Vera Rossakoff.
Who is Vera Rossakoff, Catherine?
We might remember her as someone who holds a very special place in our dear Hercule Poirot's heart.
We may. Unfortunately, the one time we've seen her thus far is in one of the 2 books that shall not be named, unless it's unavoidable, which it is in this case, The Big Four. I believe your least favorite, still my second to least favorite. I hold strong to The Secret of Chimneys being my least favorite Christie book.
As I've said, one day when I have nothing else to do, I might revisit The Secret of Chimneys to evaluate that claim. But no, Big Four definitely is the worst for me. But we've also seen or heard of the lovely Countess Rossakoff in a number of the adaptations, too.
Yes, absolutely. And she even gets name-checked every now and then in some of the novels. I think she gets name-checked in 1-2 Buckle My Shoe, probably because Christie was writing one of these short stories we're about to discuss while she was writing that novel. But yeah, we thought it would be fun. You know, we are still on the afterglow of that wonderful holiday, Valentine's Day. Love is still lingering in the air just a little bit, and we thought it would be a lark to focus on the one within the Poirot canon, not Catherine, as Kenneth Branagh would have it, but in fact, Vera Rossakoff. And there are 2 short stories in which Vera Rossakoff appears besides the Big Four. And in fact, her appearance in the first short story predates her appearance in the Big Four. So we're going to discuss the first short story and then give a tiny little, and I really mean tiny, recap of what happened in the Big Four between Vera Rossakoff and our dear Hercule Poirot, and then move into the second short story just for a full overview of this most important relationship in our dear Belgian detective's life. So, Catherine, what is the title of the first short story we will be covering?
It's called The Double Clue, and we are back once again to our old friends at the Sketch.
Oh.
And, right, I know, we don't get it so much anymore, but here it is. And so this was first published in that magazine in December 1923. And it was not actually published in the U.S. until it appeared in a short story collection, Double Sin and Other Stories, in 1961. And then it was later compiled in what we know as Poirot's Early Cases, which was September 1974.
All right, fantastic. I shall discuss our victim, who is Mr. Marcus Hardman, a collector of fine jewels and trinkets who has been robbed of his jewels. Yes, we are in a Christie jewel theft mystery, but one that I found quite charming.
Right. And so we have some suspects, and surprisingly, it's pretty limited from the beginning. We don't have an everybody's a possible suspect case here. So first we have Mr. Bernard Parker, who's basically like a young middleman to a number of antiques buyers, including Mr. Hardman. And he may engage in slightly less than ethical business arrangements, don't you think?
Yeah, there's a lot of shady dealings going on in this story. On that note, we have Countess Vera Rossakoff herself, a Russian aristocrat of the Ancien Regime, who is in exile in England and interested in selling off some of her jewels to Hardman. That's at least how she puts herself out there in the world. We'll see if that is
right, and how Mr. Hardman certainly describes her as well.
Right.
Then we have Mr. Johnston, who's a South African millionaire who has just moved to London, conveniently.
And then last, we have Lady Runcorn, who is a middle-aged, rich lady who likes to do lots of charity work.
Right, and she doesn't really have a lot of other defining characteristics, but one that we will get to.
Right. All right, let's talk about the world as it appears to be, Catherine.
So, Mr. Hardman calls in Poirot for basically the purposes of discretion, because you see he has hosted this, soiree at his house, and after the party, he, realizes he's been robbed and his emerald stolen. Given the security at the party, etc., he unfortunately realizes that it probably is somebody who he had invited. And as a result of that, he doesn't want to call in Scotland Yard because he doesn't want to first admit that the jewels are stolen, and secondly, start investigating all of the sort of fancy people he knows. So he calls in Poirot to see if Poirot can solve it discreetly.
Right. And we will, of course, be discussing the adaptation after we finish discussing the story. And that's probably the biggest difference between the original and the story, that in the original, Poirot is not the one driving the extra legal aspect of this case. It is his client, whereas it is very much Poirot driving that in the episode. And that makes for a meatier story. So I understand why they did it, but it's certainly a big difference, and it's more believable, I think, that this is coming from the client and not Poirot himself, that Scotland Yard cannot be put on the true scent here. This
is very much Poirot actually taking a job, which, sometimes we don't see that as often as one might think. It does feel like Poirot just picks stuff up that he wants to solve more often than not.
It's really, I know what you mean. It's really true. And I think maybe that also shows its early provenance in the annals of Poirot. We're in 1923 here. So this is a pretty standard detective setup, right? Private detective setup.
Right.
So there are only 4 people to suspect, as we just laid out, because they were the only people who left the main room of Mr. Hardman's place to go back to the smaller room where the safe was, mostly to pick up purses and whatnot that were left there. Mr. Hardman does not believe that it was Bernard Parker, who he trusts, nor Vera Rossakoff, who he's trying to court to buy her own jewels. She is an aristocrat, after all. And so Hardman at least turns all of his attention to Lady Runcorn, whose aunt is a kleptomaniac.
Must run in the family.
Yeah, which reminded me of Miss Van Skyler.
Angelica, Peggy, Eliza,
in Death on the Nile, actually.
Right.
There are a lot of echoes in this story of some classic Christies. We'll come across some others, so stay tuned for that. Mr. Hardman also suspects Johnston because he's the one of the 4 who he doesn't really know that well.
It is interesting just what Mr. Hardman's assumptions are, I think.
It's interesting what Mr. Hardman's assumptions are. As always, since this is an early Poirot and Hastings is the one narrating this story, it's also interesting what Hastings' assumptions are. And we get a really almost direct reference to the sexuality of Mr. Bernard Parker, because Hastings does not like him. And this is what he says when he first meets him. We found him reclining on some cushions, clad in an amazing dressing gown of purple and orange. I have seldom taken a greater dislike to anyone than I did to this particular young man with his white, effeminate face and affected, lisping speech.
Yep.
He's clearly gay.
Right.
I mean, we were talking about, those latter-day ITV adaptations supposedly injecting homosexuality and homosexual themes into Christie. They're there in the text. The word isn't used, but that's not even particularly subtle.
Well, no, and there is something also about how he operates in this sort of liminal area, right? Mm-hmm. That he's not actually part of the high society set, but yet he's not actually a criminal, right? He exists in a gray area, both obviously because of his sexuality, but also because of his societal position. They don't want to alienate him, as we'll see with both Mr. Hardman and with Countess Rossakoff. They are fond of him, but yet he's not one of them.
Right. The function that he serves, i.e. preying upon wealthy people's weaknesses so that they'll give up their jewels, right, to Mr. Hardman. I mean, that's why Mr. Hardman finds him useful, is a predatory function. And that is so in keeping with the way that marginalized characters such as gay people would have been characterized in stories in the 20s. This is Christie being very much stuck in her time, unfortunately. But
well, right. I mean, if it weren't Bernard Parker being a barely veiled gay man, the other alternative would have been that Christie would have written him as a Jew.
Right.
I mean, let's be honest. That would have been the alternative. We've seen her write a similar character before. Looking at you, Carol at End House.
Yeah. And it's this shorthand, right? It's this nasty little shorthand for, oh, you know what this kind of person is like because they're blank.
Right.
Yeah. Although, it is Hastings thinking that. So again, narrator is not the author.
Right.
Perhaps she's making a commentary. I don't think she is, but perhaps.
No, I mean, or the other Mr. Shaitana would be obviously the other major example of something like this, right?
Right. Let's never forget the Adonis butler in Lord Edgware Dies and Lord Edgware's sadistic proclivities. True.
All right, so back to the plot.
Yeah.
We're still at Mr. Hardman's house, actually, despite all of that. And Poirot asked to see the safe from which the jewels were stolen. And he finds in it, stuck in the side of the safe, he finds one man's glove. And then inside the safe, he finds a cigarette case. And the cigarette case conveniently bears the initials BP. So, of course, despite what Mr. Hardman has said defending Bernard Parker, they immediately jump to the conclusion that clearly the man's glove in the cigarette case must lead it to be Bernard Parker. And so Hardman is horrified since he employs this man regularly to do somewhat shady business that he's been robbed by him. But Poirot says that he will go personally talk to him before they call Scotland Yard.
So at Parker's house, Parker insists he didn't do anything. They ask if this glove is his, and he hesitates, which is shady. But he doesn't admit that it's his glove, and he most vigorously denies that it's his cigarette case. He says, mine is silver, that is not my cigarette case. Later on, we find out that Poirot actually finds the second glove in the hall at Bernard Parker's house. So they do, in fact, know that it is his glove. So things don't look very good for Bernard Parker. You could say that before we figure out what's actually going on here, he is assumed to be the culprit. And if it weren't for Poirot, he probably would take the blame.
Right. And he basically says, well, he's going to go talk to Mr. Hardman. Please don't go to Scotland Yard. And Poirot basically just doesn't even acknowledge it and walks away. Poirot is later then at his flat barged in on by none other than the Countess Vera Rossakoff herself, who is furious about the accusations towards Parker. She just swoops in. And of course, she immediately leaves this impression on both our dear Monsieur Poirot and Captain Hastings. She's described as a quote-unquote somewhat disturbing personality who is a whirlwind personified, and she's dressed in swooping sable, and I love this, a hat quote-unquote rampant with slaughtered osprey.
Yeah. It has, I love, that's such a good description, the rampant, because it reminds me of family crests when you use the,
sure. Yeah.
It's just, which gives off an effect of ostentation. It's a very effective description of someone being over the top and too much.
Well, except for whatever reason, neither Hastings nor Poirot seem to think she's too much. They just seem kind of stunned. They don't even really have reactions. She storms off, but before she storms off, she is shown the glove and the cigarette case. And she basically says she doesn't recognize the glove, but oh yes, that cigarette case does belong to Parker. And that's when we find out that Poirot actually has found the glove's mate. So here we have the double clue, right? Why are both of these things found in the safe?
Right, and I love that because it's Christie hanging a lantern, you could say, on the trope within detective novels where there are often too many clues.
Right.
Because that's ridiculous, which reminded me of Murder on the Orient Express. We had the same issue there, and Poirot realized, there are way too many things dropped in this train compartment that this can't be real. And it's the exact same thing here, where he says 2 clues within this little jewel theft case and around this safe is just one too many. So honestly, I might argue it's too many because even 1 clue feels convenient, but we can handle 1 clue. So Poirot is determined to get to the bottom of this, and Lady Runcorn is basically out of this from the get-go, despite her kleptomaniac aunt. Poirot does his due diligence and goes to check out Mr. Johnston, who's not at home, but whose secretary very explicitly lays out his South African bona fides, including the fact that he made his millions in gold and is not particularly interested in jewels. The whole suspicion that he might be pretending to be a South African millionaire reminded me of Bloor in And Then There Were None,
right?
Because that's exactly what he did.
Although Bloor didn't convince anybody.
No, he did it very, very badly. But it was South Africa. I guess South Africa is just far enough away that it's a good cover.
Although I have to say the Afrikaans accent is pretty recognizable. So like you would have to be able to do a pretty good job at mastering that.
I know. I would not want to be tasked with imitating a South African accent convincingly.
Please, Mr. President. It makes complete sense to me. On the day of a big match, say a test, in the bus on the way to the stadium, nobody talks.
No, definitely not. Although it's the funny thing is that's Poirot says actually very early on when they're leaving Hardman's house that of course the 2 people that you'd be most suspicious of are Mr. Johnston and the Countess Rossakoff, because those would be the 2 easiest to pretend to be, because nobody knows anybody from South Africa. You couldn't check on him.
Right.
And also, after the revolution, anybody from the Ancien Regime who has fled to the West, there's really no ability to look them up either. You know, you can't really send off a telegram and figure out what's going on.
No, it's true. Shades of Anastasia, etc. So,
right, correct.
Oh, since the revolution, our lives have been so great. Thank goodness for the gossip that gets us through the day. There's a rumor in St. Petersburg. What they're saying on the street. Although the Tsar did not survive, one daughter may be still alive. The princess Anastasia. But please do not repeat.
So what does Hastings find Poirot doing later on, Catherine, which I would argue is our only clue?
Oh, it's the only clue. He's studying a Russian grammar book. And because Hastings, much like Poirot, is a little bit taken aback by the force that is Vera Rossakoff. He kind of thinks that Poirot is trying to immediately learn Russian so that he can speak with the Countess. And Hastings kind of raises an eyebrow and says, well, any well-bred Russian aristocrat would speak perfect French, which is true. And Poirot is like, oh, yeah, you think, Hastings? Tell us more interesting tidbits. He's very kind of catty about Hastings mentioning the fact that, of course, Vera Rossakoff would speak French.
Right.
But Poirot actually insists that what he's fascinated by are the intricacies of the Russian alphabet, i.e. Cyrillic.
We do well to think about that.
At this point, anybody who has any basic understanding of Russian knows where the story is going, or
I would argue anyone who's read Murder on the Orient Express also would know where this is going, because this exact clue is within Murder on the Orient Express.
Yes, it is.
So the next day, Poirot goes to Hardman's house with a slip of paper bearing the name of the thief. And when Hardman reads it and is horrified, he gives Poirot carte blanche to handle the matter discreetly before resorting to going to Scotland Yard. So this is where we find out what is going on here in the world as it actually is. Who done it, Catherine?
Poirot leaves Hardman's and goes to, where else? The Countess Rossakoff's hotel room. Yep, and she greets him in a fancy negligee. Or as Hastings puts it, a marvelous negligee of barbaric design, which I really would like to know what that negligee looks like.
It's definitely different from Madeleine de Sarra's creamy chiffon negligees.
definitely different.
It's more fur, I guess. I'm imagining a lot of fur and slits everywhere.
I'm actually picturing something like more 19th century, kind of like upholstered.
Right,
so like,
right.
I'm picturing more something like that, feathers probably. But when Poirot and Hastings arrive, she immediately checks to see, her primary concern, did he clear poor Bernard Parker? And Poirot says, well, yes, yeah, of course he has, but he still will have to now be returning the jewels. And then he waits.
And it's not clear what she's going to do or how she's going to react. But after a moment, she bursts into laughter. And she goes to her dresser drawer and she retrieves the jewels and she hands them to Poirot. And they banter adorably before Poirot and Hastings leave. And Poirot hands her the cigarette case back because it is, of course, her cigarette case. And she immediately murmurs, I see. And Hastings and a very smitten Poirot leave. So what happened, Catherine? How is it possibly her cigarette case?
How did he know that it was her cigarette case when it had Parker's initials? Well, because the little gray cells had him reading that Russian primer for a good reason. It's because, unlike the initial assumption that it'd be easy to fake being Russian or South African, the Countess Rossakoff is indeed Russian. Whether or not she's really a countess, who knows? But she is Russian. And in Cyrillic, B shape is a V sound. And a P shape makes an R sound. And whose name begins with a V and an R? Oh, that's right. Vera Rossakoff.
And yes, we saw that clue in Murder on the Orient Express.
Later, of course.
Right, later, with Princess Natalia Dragomirov. I believe it looked like an H, but it was actually an N. Is that correct? Catherine has some knowledge of the Cyrillic alphabet, right?
Well, an H sounds like an N.
There you go. So, yeah, it turns out the lovely Countess is a bit of a jewel thief to finance her high-flying émigré lifestyle. Because it's not cheap going about in barbaric nightgowns and swoops of sable. So,
no.
Girls got to do what a girl's got to do.
I mean, all those ospreys, she had to have them mounted on her hat some way. It is implied, pretty sincerely on her part that she has become a pragmatist. She's essentially left her country and she's stuck in the West. And clearly what she's doing to make her income is that she has become a jewel thief.
Yeah, so, I mean, we are. I think we are to believe that she certainly is Russian and that she probably did at least have a great fall from the top of the social hierarchy when the revolution happened.
But again, we don't know, and there's no way to know.
Right. And again, let's remind ourselves it is 1923, so that timeline does work out, because that would have been just 6 years earlier. So,
right.
Again, Anastasia.
Oh, dear.
Oh, dear. I'd like to talk briefly about the David Suchet adaptation, which is an early one. It's in season/series 3. And it's delightful. It definitely does a lot more with the Vera Rossakoff and Poirot romance than the story does. In the story, he admires her, and what he admires specifically is her capitulation. That's really what he admires. He admires that she knew when to give up.
Right.
Which I found very interesting. This is what he says. I tell you, Hastings, a woman who can accept defeat like that with a careless smile will go far. She is dangerous. She has the nerves of steel. He tripped heavily. That's Christie writing that he tripped heavily because he's a doofus.
He's smitten is what he is.
He's smitten, but it's interesting because it's not actually, I think, if you read this story, it is not portrayed the same way by Christie as Irene Adler is portrayed by Arthur Conan Doyle for Sherlock Holmes, because she outsmarts him, and she truly is the one woman who he considers, perhaps the one person who he considers his equal intellectually.
Irene Adler is. Yeah.
And I think people make the mistake of calling Vera Rossakoff Poirot's Irene Adler. David Suchet even does it in his book. He says, like Irene Adler for Sherlock Holmes, the Countess will always be, quote, the woman, end quote, for Poirot. I don't know. I think that's giving the Poirot-Vera Rossakoff relationship a little more elaboration than it's actually getting within this short story.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I think that he obviously likes that he was the one to figure her out when obviously she's taken in quite a number of people.
Sure. But he figures out a lot of people.
Yeah,
take in other people.
But
that's kind of what he does.
But they get, frustrated and angry about it, and she is bemused, right? That's her reaction.
No, absolutely. I mean, it's true. What marks her apart from others is her sense of humor. And right. I guess her bewitching pragmatism about the whole thing. He appreciates it. He admires it. But that's still not what's going on between Sherlock Holmes and Irene Adler by any stretch.
No, of course not. And I mean, we'll get to this in the second story, but there is something I think even about how she looks that clearly both Hastings and Poirot are a little bit bowled over by. It's certainly made out to be that she's like fabulous.
Yeah.
I kind of picture her a little bit. I think maybe it's all the dead ospreys and the sable, but do you know Madeline Kahn in Young Frankenstein?
Yes.
Excuse me, darling. Tell me, exactly what is it that you do?
She has on like a turban, and then she has on a stole around her neck with a head still attached. Right. And the rings and the sables and like a turban and, Yeah,
she's this larger than life whirlwind of a woman. She has a zest for life that he appreciates, and she knows when to call it quits. And that's great. To me, it's not actually, even though he clearly admires her physical appearance and she's beautiful, and I don't think they would have had the same appreciation for her zest for life if she weren't beautiful. It's not actually a romantic appreciation per se. She also reminds me a little bit of Auntie Mame.
Life is a banquet and most poor suckers are starving to death. Come on now, child.
Sure, yeah.
To me, it just doesn't feel like a...
Well, I mean, or speaking of old musicals, it's also like Dolly Levy, right?
Hello, Dolly.
Glad to see you, Hank. Let's thank my lucky star.
That too.
Yeah, I like it. I mean, the reason why I'm harping on this, what I think is a false parallel between Vera Rossakoff and Poirot and Irene Adler and Holmes, is that I think it's a little more interesting what Christie set up with Poirot and Vera Rossakoff. And I think, she clearly made the choice not to go too far with romantic allusions when it came to Poirot. That is not the same choice that the Suchet series made, and it is one of the significant ways that the series departs from canon, and they don't depart much, but you can see it in this episode. It is a insanely romantic episode. I have a still shot of a picnic that the two of them go on that is just the most romantic picnic I have ever seen. I want to be on that picnic. And Suchet even writes about how they reenacted for the episode one of the most romantic scenes in the history of British cinema, the lovers parting in David Lean's brief encounter. Although this time it is the woman who is leaving the country for a new life, while Poirot is left standing on the station platform alone with his thoughts of what might have been.
You will keep it, I hope? Something to remember me by?
Oh. I won't forget you. Hercule.
Nor are you. Countess.
But I don't necessarily love that they did that, especially because we talked in a previous episode of ours about the chocolate box, which I thought was an effective episode within the Suchet series where they did fabricate a romantic, a long-lost romantic love, the one who got away. And I think I would have preferred just to keep it at that for Poirot, but that's just me.
We'll get to the next story in a minute, but the next story has like a depth to it that doesn't really exist in the text previous to it. And it almost feels a little bit like the adaptation is filling in a gap.
The Suchet adaptation?
Yeah, it's filling in a gap for the capture of Cerberus, which we're going to cover next, because that story seems to imply that there is a greater depth to this relationship than we actually see.
That's a perfect segue into our interstitial summation as to what happens between Poirot and Vera Rossakoff in the Big Four, because the double clue ends with Poirot musing, I wonder if we shall meet again. So Christie clearly at that point was already planning another meeting, and the Big Four was published in short story form soon after that. Again, this is all happening in the 20s. And within that story, Vera Rossakoff is instrumental in saving Poirot and Hastings's lives because they are trapped by the evil criminal masterminds within that ridiculous storyline. And Vera Rossakoff is their henchwoman, one of their hench people. And she's not going to help them. But then Poirot says, well, I have the power to bring back the dead. I will reunite you with your son. And we find out that she has a young son who she thought was dead. But Poirot, and this is like there's never any foreshadowing for this whatsoever within the Big Four. We just find out as it's happening that Poirot found the son and was able to help him get back into good health on the off chance that he would need to do this very thing. And
it's so weird.
It's so weird. And endear Vera Rossakoff to him, which, by the way, is horrible. Shouldn't he have told Vera Rossakoff that her son was alive anyway, not just on the off chance that she needed to help him? That seems very mercenary of Poirot.
Yes,
but
it does.
In any case, she does help them, and she helps them to escape. And she is reunited with her son. And that is the last that we see of Poirot and Vera Rossakoff until the capture of Cerberus. So I would argue that as ridiculous as that episode is within the Big Four, that is certainly a lot of history there,
right, it is. Right.
Between them. So let's talk about the capture of Cerberus, which is our second short story that we're covering in this episode.
So the capture of Cerberus was actually one of the only stories in the Labors of Hercules to not be published in short story form in the UK. It was rejected by the Strand, which published, I think, all of the other stories in Labors of Hercules. But it wasn't exactly this story. We can get to that. I know that, Kemper, you certainly have something to say about that. And
as always,
so it was edited by Christie. And then it was published in the U.S. in March 1947 under the title Meet Me in Hell. And then, of course, it appears that same year in The Labors of Hercules.
Right, which is a short story collection that we haven't covered thus far. We haven't gotten to any of the Labors of Hercules stories. I know that John Curran, who we'll be talking about when we discuss that alternate version of the story, I believe it's his favorite short story collection, The Labors of Hercules. And it is pretty ingenious. Christie set herself the task of telling 12 short stories that would in some way relate to the 12 labors of the Greek mythological Hercules for her detective Hercule Poirot. So not surprisingly, she did it. She was able to accomplish that task. It's a really fun collection, and it's the latest collection of Poirot short stories, which is why we haven't gotten to it yet, because we're sort of very generally and vaguely going in chronological order as we cover those Poirot short stories.
Right. And so we should also note that the capture of Cerberus is the last of the Labors of Hercules, the mythological figure, and it's also the last of the short stories in the collection.
All right, well, let's talk about our victims, because there are a lot of them in this story, because they are young Londoners who are all kinds of high on the drugs.
On the
so
drugs.
To speak. On the drugs. Not a who done it, but a who dealt it. Although that just makes me think of whoever smelt it, dealt it.
No, that's exactly what I was going to say. I was like,
I know you were thinking that, Catherine.
It was totally what I was thinking. I was like, oh, this is just now a fart story.
All right, well, who are our suspects, Catherine?
Hell and its owners.
Hell, you said?
Hell. Whoever those owners of Hell might be. They seem to be providing the drugs to the youth.
The youth of London. And we'll find out exactly what Catherine means by hell in just a little bit as we get into the world as it appears to be. So Poirot is bemoaning all sorts of mod cons, in particular the Underground, which he is forced to ride. He is also not thrilled with the present-day women riding the subway. And Quel horror, knitting.
Oh my God, the knitting.
It actually made me imagine that one of the women was Miss Marple, and it just made me think about how Christie spoke about how she had zero interest in ever having Poirot and Miss Marple meet. And I'm just pretty sure that they really wouldn't like each other. Like, I'm not saying that Christie even said this, but I think Poirot would just, find her gauche and Miss Marple would find him appalling.
Oh, they would not like one another. I don't even think there's a question about it. I'm not even sure that they would be capable of respecting one another.
Oh, it's so sad.
I
It makes
know.
me sad. But in any case, as Poirot is riding the escalator up out of the underground, he happens to hear a woman calling for him. And this is not a knitting modern woman, but a gloriously, extravagantly dressed force of a woman.
Oh, my
Does that sound
goodness.
familiar? Who is it but the Countess Vera Rossakoff after all these years? Poirot desperately wants to talk to her, but she's headed down the escalator. He's going up. Oh, my God, this is such a meet cute. And he shouts after her, "Where can I meet you?" And she responds, "In hell."
Right. And he tries to chase after her, but she's long gone, apparently to hell. So Poirot, in one of the more delightful sequences I think we've read in any Christie recently, Poirot, who's completely befuddled, goes back to his flat where Miss Lemon is dutifully typing. And he asks her what she would do if an acquaintance asked her to meet them in hell. And Miss Lemon doesn't even look up from the typewriter, and she replies, "I'd make a reservation."
Right. Although I would like to point out this is where we get one of those references to the textual Miss Lemon's appearance.
I know, it's not great.
Christie writes, and this was because this is one of the later Poirot short stories. This is not narrated by Hastings, but just has a third-person narrator. Miss Lemon was unbelievably ugly and incredibly efficient. Yeah, and all she thinks about is a new filing system, which that is actually in keeping with Pauline Moran's version. But Miss Lemon, for me, will never be unbelievably ugly because she looks like Pauline Moran.
Right, of
It
course.
was quite fetching.
Agreed. It's an unfortunate line in an otherwise delightful few pages. Because to the idea that you would make a reservation for hell, Poirot just doesn't even have a response. And how rare is it that we see Poirot incapable of responding to something? But he is floored. He doesn't know what to say. He's kind of sputtering. And Miss Lemon really doesn't notice and basically asks if he'd also like a membership because she can get to work on that too and have it to him by evening. And again, he just is standing there bewildered. So finally, Miss Lemon realizes that he does not realize that hell is the most fashionable new nightclub in London.
Yeah, I mean, he's a little slow on the uptake there. Let's be honest.
Yes.
It reminded me a little bit of that Sex and the City episode where they go to bed.
What can we do that would be fantastic?
I know. I'm taking you to bed.
I'm not that off, man.
No, bed. It's a new club opening tonight. We'll all go.
There's like 4 too many puns with bed. Like, oh, we're going to bed. I'm going to take you to bed. It's like, okay, we get it. The nightclub's called Bed. I felt a little bit of that here. Okay, it's called Hell. Let's move on. And I liked Miss Lemon's impatience with him because he finally, after requiring this explanation, she gives it to him, and then we're told, whereupon, having wasted, as she made obvious, quite time enough, Miss Lemon broke into a perfect fusillade of efficient typing. Miss Lemon suffers no fools, and it's rare that Poirot is portrayed as one of those fools. But it's convincing here, and it's very charming. So later that night, Poirot descends into hell, and it is indeed hell-themed, including a bridge over a pool/river, Styx, complete with a real, extremely large dog named Cerberus. Doesn't have 3 heads, but, can't have everything. Upon entering, he is greeted by Vera herself, who is delighted to see him. He did note, by the way, when he was musing about their ship's passing moment, that her makeup now resembled a scene painter's sunset, with the woman under the makeup well hidden from sight. But he was still very much taken by her dramatic appearance and just all of the flair and the verve and exactly what we were talking about.
Yeah, Vera
Hello, Dolly, Auntie Mame, etc., etc.
Vera Rossakoff is not going to be knitting in the tube.
No. She seats him at her table, along with her friend and historical advisor, Professor Liskeard. and a Dr. Alice Cunningham, who is a mousy young woman in unfashionable tweeds, who, as it turns out, is affianced to Vera's son, who, again, remember we heard about in The Big Four. And Alice is a psychologist studying the criminal mind. She also does not appear to remotely like Poirot, nor he her. Very much water and oil, these two. She's the anti-Vera Rossakoff. And her son, we should just say here, we never meet her son, ever.
No, and he's either an architect or an engineer or something like that in America.
Alice, the totally dowdy, not fun future daughter-in-law of Vera Rossakoff, eventually leaves Poirot. And she is going to go quiz a handsome but shady sort named Paul Varesco about his childhood because she thinks that he would just be an interesting specimen to examine in her no-fun analytical way. Poirot then, at that point, across the room, sees another handsome young man dressed in evening wear who he knows to be an up-and-coming Scotland Yard detective.
Right, so maybe not there for fun, which we get confirmed because at Scotland Yard, Poirot goes to see none other than, oh my gosh, Kemper, guess who Poirot gets to go see?
Inspector Japp!
Inspector Japp. We get both Miss Lemon and Inspector Japp in this story.
It's pretty unusual that we get 2 out of 3 of the supporting cast within the actual Christie text.
I know. It's very exciting. Japp is happy, as usual, to see Poirot. He confirms that, Poirot spied one of his detectives and that they've actually been keeping tabs on Hell for a while because there's been a massive wave of drugs infusing sort of hip, young London society, and they know 2 things about it. One, it seems to be getting paid for in jewels and not in cash. And it seems to be traceable back to Hell, which has very opaque ownership. So they believe that the real owner of the club is none other than that Paul Varesco, but they can't decisively link him to the club. So they've even executed like a raid on the club, but to no avail, other than they actually caught a murderer who just happened to coincidentally be there, and their raid force recognized him. So, I guess catching a murderer there was pretty good.
So Poirot has a very serious conversation with Vera about what she's doing. He asks her who owns the club, and she evades the question. He then tells her about the drug connection. She vehemently insists that she has nothing to do with that. And while she may be a jewel thief, she would never be involved with a drug ring. She only goes so far with these things.
Right.
She denies, however, that she's not really an owner of the club, and she refuses to admit Varesco's involvement. Poirot is dismayed by this because he's trying to protect her from an upcoming police raid. He doesn't want her to get in trouble again, and this time things aren't going to be kept outside of the law. So Japp has filled in Poirot that they're going to raid the club, and that there's the secret entrance/exit behind the bar that they weren't watching the last time, and they're going to be watching it this time to see who uses it and who is just responsible for the dirty dealing going on in this club.
Right. So Poirot, in the meantime, hires a dirty, smelly, small, maybe homeless man named Higgs to do something. What he hires him to do is unclear. Basically, Poirot stations the man outside of the club to wait for the raid. So when the raid happens, all of the lights go out, and basically from what we know, Poirot heads out to the street as well, and then he goes home to wait. So when Japp calls in the next morning, he says that Professor Liskyard had jewels in his pocket, but that Scotland Yard really believes him when he says that he's entirely clueless, and they believe that he's framed, and worse, they found no drugs. In fact, those people who were going out through the secret entrance were like socialites and somebody who's marrying into the royal family and people who don't want to be seen going in and out of this nightclub. Poirot listens to all this, and then he calmly tells Japp, well, yeah, of course he didn't find the drugs because he, Hercule Poirot, has the drugs.
Right. Christie has an amusing political joke within here. She doesn't usually get overtly political, at least not in the short stories, but Japp tells him that one of the people they see coming out of the club is Vitamian Evans, the cabinet minister, who is a member of the Labour Party, and he says, you have to be so careful. Nobody minds a Tory politician spending money on riotous living because the taxpayers think it's his own money. But when it's a Labour man, the public feels it's their money he's spending. And so it is a manner of speaking. I thought that was a funny joke sort of on behalf of labor for...
surprisingly, yeah.
Yeah,
but,
for the conservative-leaning Christie. So let's talk about the world as it actually is, because Poirot is no drug pusher.
Because I'm a pusher. I push people.
So ignoring a flabbergasted Jep, Poirot greets Vera at the door, where she finally reveals that, yes, the ownership of the club truly lies with Paul Varesco. And on top of that, he tried to frame her the previous night by dumping the jewels that were used to pay for these drugs in her purse. She caught on quickly, though, because she's no fool. And she dumped the jewels into the pocket of what she thought was Poirot's coat, but was actually Professor Liskeard's. It was pitch black, after all. And Vera is just the proprietor of the nightclub, and she's not involved in its criminal element, outside of encouraging criminals to fraternize there because it's glamorous and super fun to rub up against the underworld when you're within the posh crowd. But that's as far as she goes. So in this case... and in this story, Vera Rossakoff's protestations are the truth, unlike in our first story.
Right. And she dumped the jewels into what she thought was Poirot's coat because she didn't know what to do with them. And she figured, well, of all the people who would be let out of the club without being searched, obviously it would be Poirot.
And he can take care of himself. Not in a mean way. She figured that was just in all ways the safest place to put something illicit.
Right. In another room in the flat, Higgs is stationed with none other than Cerberus, Vera's giant dog. And Vera is understandably really surprised, mostly because Cerberus only lets her and people extremely close to her even near him, because he's a giant, vicious dog. And she controls him by whispering to him in Russian. And only with certain phrases will he go from being an attack dog to, like, a nice puppy. And so Poirot gets her to utter the phrase that makes Cerberus release his death grip of a jaw. And when she does, what drops out of the dog's mouth but a package of cocaine? Yikes.
Yikes. And Vera, has yet another yikes moment where she's horrified. She insists she had nothing to do with the drug that was found in her dog's mouth, but Poirot already knows that. And the one clue here is that only a person who was close to Cerberus would have been able to stuff drugs in the dog's mouth. Otherwise, the dog would never have been coaxed into holding on to the package the way that he did. Who did it, Catherine?
Well, who in this story is close to Cerberus other than Vera? Her daughter-in-law to be, Dr. Alice Cunningham, who has apparently taken her interest in criminal psychology a little too far and crossed over into running a crime syndicate alongside Paul Varesco. Her frumpy tweeds are exactly that frumpy because they have plenty of pockets to conveniently hide not just jewels, but also cocaine. And because her status, as well as her frumpy looks, mean that she's consistently overlooked. Nobody would ever suspect her. Except Poirot, who immediately didn't like her and is suspicious of her, and who is waiting there in the dark by Cerberus the dog for when she goes to hide the drugs with that Russian phrase when the lights go out. And he manages to snip some fabric from her jacket in the dark while she's feeding the drug packet to the dog.
Right, thereby proving beyond a doubt that it had to be her. We could say it's a clue that Poirot harps on the unwomanly way that she insists on dressing and with these baggy clothes and all the pockets, etc., etc.
And it would be more of a clue if he hadn't been harping on all of the women in the underground at the beginning of the story.
Right. Christie buries the clue a little bit by opening the story that way.
Right.
So Vera is, of course, thrilled with Poirot for saving her, not only from jail time for running a drug ring, but from having an awful daughter-in-law.
Right.
Because obviously her beloved son is not going to marry Dr. Alice Cunningham anymore. And the story ends with our ever-efficient Miss Lemon finding a receipt for red roses that Poirot has sent to the Countess.
And the funniest thing is Miss Lemon just stares at it thinking it must be a mistake because, well, he's far too old for that.
Yeah, there's definitely not as much of an understanding between Poirot and Miss Lemon as there is between David Suchet and Pauline Moran's versions of these characters in the series.
No. There's also another line that Christie has that's something to the effect of, it is like the great misfortune of very small men to be enamored of very large women.
And that is actually a line that was in the original version of the story.
Yes, it is.
And one of the ones that I noticed was lifted when she heavily edited this story. It is the misfortune of small, precise men to hanker after large and flamboyant women. Poirot had never been able to rid himself of the fatal fascination the Countess held for him. So, that is textual evidence. There's an argument to be made that it's romantic in nature. There's certainly a romantic tinge to it. Even in this story, it's a little ridiculous. It's a little comedic.
Yeah, it is, but it's pretty, explicitly there. Also, Poirot doesn't normally, well, that's not true. He does it literally all the time, go around the law. But he's really uninterested in the actual drug crime. I mean, in all honesty, he seems to have very, very little interest in the fact that there is this rampant drug ring in London. All he really cares about is that she's not going to get in trouble.
It's true. And, we've seen Papa Poirot work a case on behalf of young lovers to get their happy ending time and time again. It's just that it's always other lovers and other people's happiness, not someone who he himself is interested in. But this is the one exception where he has a personal stake here, giving red roses to her because her son is getting engaged to some other rich woman, which I love that Dr. Alice Cunningham is immediately replaced by someone richer, is sweet. It's not red-bloodedly romantic. It's not like he's taking her in his arms anytime soon. But
although you don't generally buy, and this is what Miss Lemon basically thinks, is that you don't generally buy red roses for somebody who you're not romantically interested in.
It's true. Just really quick, it is interesting that there was this earlier version of the story, which is why this 12th and final story was not published in short story form, because the original version was rejected and Christie had to heavily edit it before putting it in the novelized collection of short stories.
It almost doesn't even seem fair to say that it was heavily edited because it's a different story.
It's a different story. You're right. She rewrote it. It's true. We shouldn't say that. She rewrote it.
I mean, it has certain lines in common. It has certain elements in common, but it's a different plot.
Right. She lifted certain lines and even passages. Countess Vera Rossakoff does appear in the original story, not on an escalator, but the story opens up actually in Lake Geneva. He runs into her there, and it's not quite as dramatic, but she is just as dramatic as in the rewritten story.
She just gets up and leaves her dining companion when she sees Poirot, and then just sits down at his table, and eventually her dining companion comes over to interrupt.
Yes, so her dining companion is sort of the professor character from the rewritten version of the story, this dry professor character.
He recognizes Poirot and he needs Poirot's help.
Right, because he says that his son, this man named Hans Lutzmann, is notorious because he has just recently been convicted posthumously of murdering this grandiose dictator, Herr Herzlein. The story directly mentions the Nazis, and yet Herr Herzlein is pretty obviously supposed to be Adolf Hitler.
Yeah, but then there's this entire weird element that Herr Herzlein, he's the figurehead and that there are other people actually working the levers of power.
Right. The twist of the story and what Poirot finally figures out is that Herzlein is a tool who has actually had a change of heart. He realized that he was being used for evil purposes by these shadowy people in the background, and that he actually now wants to use his powers of speech, all of his prowess as a great speaker, very similar to, again, the real-life counterpart. He wants to now use them for good, and that this whole supposed assassination was trumped up and not real, and that this man's son didn't kill him because he actually didn't die. He wasn't killed. The poor professor's son was killed because then the people around him thought that he had just shot this great dictator, and he was essentially ripped to pieces by a frenzied crowd. So that's terrible. But Herzlein...
I wonder why this story wasn't published.
Yeah, but Herzlein goes into hiding, and Poirot eventually finds him, and they have a heart-to-heart where Poirot convinces him to come out of hiding and come clean about what's happening and essentially use his powers for good and clear this professor's son's name, this would-be killer. Even though he's dead, ripped apart by a crowd, he can at least have his name cleared. And that is what happens at the end of the story, but it's bizarre.
It's like Nazi fan fiction. Weird.
It's a little bit of not like Nazi fan fiction. It obviously wasn't intended that way, but we can see why the Strand read it and said, yeah, we're not publishing this.
The premise, right, is that he's actually more valuable assassinated or appearing to be assassinated, because then it turns him into a martyr. So instead of actually getting rid of the threat, it only riles the crowds further.
Right.
And then there are these like very, very thinly veiled stand-ins for Goebbels and like other members of the Nazi hierarchy in this story too.
Oh, yeah. And here's the thing. The chronology of when the short story was written does explain why Christie would have written what feels like such an odd short story once all of World War II was in the rearview mirror. And we came across this a little bit with NRM as well, which was written at the beginning of World War II. These short stories were being handed into the Strand and published in 1940. So they were published beginning in November 1939 and culminating in September 1940. That's the Nemean Lion up to the Apples of the Hesperides. Apparently there's a letter dated January 12, 1940, when Christie's agent, Edmund Cork, wrote to her about the 12th story, The Capture of Cerberus, saying that the Strand wasn't going to publish it. And she asked for it back, and she said that she would rewrite it, but she actually didn't apparently get around to rewriting it because she was busy writing 18 other things until the collection came out, which was a full 7 years later. So I have to imagine that Christie never would have written this story in 1945. And
we'd hope not.
This was a less strange story to write in 1939 because World War II hadn't played out yet. I mean, it had begun, but it hadn't played out yet.
I suppose so, but some editors at the Strand looked at it in 1939 and thought, no. I
think it's strange, too. I don't think writing a story in which there's a character clearly based on Hitler who's good makes a whole lot of sense, even in 1940. I just think that it's hard to realize how much less strange it probably was in 1940 than it was in 1945 and forever thereafter up until the present day.
Again, I would say that was fair if not for the fact that the Strand obviously also did not think so. But
sure, we just have to account for the fact that Christie wrote it. It is odd. It's odd.
It's very hard to imagine her sitting down and thinking that was a good idea.
Yeah, it's problematic, and I think it's understandable that it didn't get published in that form. It is fascinating to read, though, and I will plug for the billionth time on this podcast John Curran's book, Agatha Christie's Secret Notebooks, because he includes that original version of The Capture of Cerberus as an appendix at the back of the book with a lot of interesting information that I've just been drawing upon as to how that first version came about and then how it was rewritten into the second version. It's a weird little corner of the Christieverse, for sure. We should mention that we're not going to discuss the adaptation of The Labors of Hercules within the David Suchet series, which appeared in the last season/series of the show. And that's probably the most controversial adaptation because it kind of sort of incorporates all of the 12 Labors of Hercules, but also does a lot of expansion and invention of its own. And Vera Rossakoff is actually in that episode, but we will discuss what's going on there in greater detail when we cover the other 12 Labors of Hercules. And I think it's interesting to note that this is one of the few times that the series broke with its continuity in terms of actors, because Kika Markham played Countess Rossakoff in that early episode of The Double Clue, and then Orla Brady played her in this later episode. And I think that is telling. That episode is an outlier within the series. It's very, very strange.
Yeah.
And I think unfortunate, but we'll talk about that more at another point.
We can get there. Right.
That is the end of our super mega Vera Rossakoff themed episode.
I know. I wish we had some more of her, but But
I do too. I really wish we had more of her. Yeah, we'll take what we can get. We would love for you to join us next time when we will be covering another short story, The Golden Ball, within the Listerdale Mystery Collection. Obviously, that was collected in the U.S. as part of The Golden Ball and other stories. And in the meantime, we'd love to hear from you. You can email us at allaboutthedame@gmail.com or find us on Twitter at allaboutthedame. You can find Catherine at Brobcat. Our Facebook page is All About Agatha, and our Instagram handle is at All About Agatha. And we would love it if you took a moment to rate and review us, and we'll see you next time. Bye.
Bye.
Have you made the switch to NYX? Millions of women have made the switch to the revolutionary period underwear from NYX. That's KNIX. Period panties from NYX are like no other, making them the #1 leak-proof underwear brand in North America. They're comfy, stylish, and absorbent, perfect for period protection from your lightest to your heaviest days. They look, feel, and machine wash just like regular underwear, but feature incognito protection that has you covered. You can shop sizes from extra small to 4XL. Choose from all kinds of colors, prints, and different styles, from bikinis to boy shorts, thongs to high-rise. You've got to try NYX. See why millions are ditching disposable, wasteful period products and have switched to NYX. Go to knix.com and get 15% off with promo code TRY15. That's knix.com, promo code TRY15 for 15% off life-changing period underwear. That's knix.com.